Thank you for joining Pluralist Points. Today we have Ilana Redstone. Today she's a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, co-founder of the Mill Institute at UATX, formerly a fellow in our pluralism and civil exchange program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's creator of the Bigots and Snowflakes video series. She's also the author of the book Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less, which is the subject of our conversation today. Thanks, Alana, for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure.
Now, before we get into what the certainty trap is, you spend a bit of time in the book reflecting on the complexity of life and the idea that many things aren't as simple as we might think, which, in some ways is the first proposition to begin with in order to start uncovering the certainty trap. So for you, where did this appreciation come from? Was that from your time as a Peace Corps volunteer? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it probably is a combination of things. I think to some extent, it's probably just how I'm wired. Just we all are sort of different, a little vary in different ways in that respect. So I think to some extent, it's how I was wired. I think to some extent, it's probably childhood stuff. Which I will spare this audience. And I think a lot of it, and I think there's a big piece of it that kind of like what you said is about Peace Corps. Peace Corps is a huge, that's obviously a significant experience, as well as other traveling. Because traveling, one of the things, one of the things traveling and living outside of your own country, living outside of your own perhaps it may be the case. It doesn't even have to be outside your own country, but just outside your own culture, and sort of understanding that the world is really full of people just kind of trying to do the best they can. And that applies to people that you hate politically too.
That's right. That's right. Now, is complexity uncomfortable? When politicians serve up simple answers, those things seem to resonate with people a lot. And it just makes me wonder about, people's level of comfort with complexity.
It's a good question. I mean, I think that to some extent, yes, complexity. We seek patterns. We have this very strong instinct to both seek patterns, to simplify information, and it's sort of the corollary to what you're saying is to be tribal and to sort of divide. And those are all different either inputs or consequences of oversimplification. So, I mean, I do think it's uncomfortable. I think that, I was just giving a talk yesterday morning and a similar point came up, and basically that what I'm asking people to do in the certainty trap and sort of question and clarify our thinking, it goes against a pretty strong and basic human instinct to not do that, right? To categorize people, to generalize, to make assumptions. And so in the book, this is why in the book I say, at some level, in order for this to matter, like you have to care about something more than you care about being right. Whether that's, and there's really sort of two main candidates for that. One is you just really want to understand as best you can, or as best we can, what's true about the world. And the other is, I'm sure we'll talk about this, is because it has all kinds of implications for democracy and our ability to self-govern.
Yeah. Now, I came away from the book seeing this as a book of practical philosophy. I don't know
I
if
love
you've
it.
gotten this kind of feedback, but your PhD is in demography and sociology.
Yeah.
Um, is philosophy part of your background?
No, it's not. And I don't have any of the bona fides to sort of prove myself as a philosopher. But I think
You are naturally, you're a natural
I have
philosopher.
philosophy envy.
Yeah.
I no, I like that's a compliment. So thank you. Yeah, there's a huge part. This is sort of the practical implication. I mean, what I see the book as in some ways is connecting these different parts because you're right that there is a very philosophically interesting places that you can go when you start to challenge certainty. Like, so just going back to this example that I mentioned about this person yesterday who said this, we're going against this very basic instinct. Which he's right. Like, he was right to bring up the point. And I said, well, I was like, if you follow that thread, it raises some very interesting questions about, okay, if we can't overcome this instinct to be tribal, to sort of to see things categorically, then is democracy actually sustainable in the long term? That's not a question I try and answer in the book. I don't think I could, but like, it does raise questions. And if you raise questions about certainty, you can, and a lot of what I talk about in the book is sort of treating our knowledge as provisional rather than definitive. Again, like, you can get into some very philosophically interesting places about the nature of reality and what we understand about the world. I mean, I find that stuff really interesting. Um, and I also understand that there are some people who will be interested in the book really because of its what it means for a political discourse. But like, if the question is, are there philosophical questions that are raised? Absolutely. I mean, I think they're fascinating. But even if they're not interesting to you, to a reader, like, you could be drawn to the book simply because of the implications for how we think and communicate with other people.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who studied philosophy in college, I
Oh, I didn't
enjoyed it.
realize that. Okay.
I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Okay.
Um,
Do you think I could be an honorary member?
of course, of course. Now, what is the certainty trap?
So the best way to describe the certainty trap, I think, is by, and I've given this a lot of thought, like, in terms of the simplest way to describe it, is I think how it feels when we're in it. And so when we're in the certainty trap, we tend to demonize, dismiss, and become contemptuous of people who disagree. Particularly, you could, again, this is the philosophical piece. You could make a more general claim, but I'm mostly focusing on particularly around heated and contentious issues. And we tend to, so a couple of these things I've already said, we tend to treat our knowledge as definitive, instead of provisional, which leads us to draw conclusions and then judge people who disagree, judge harshly people who disagree. The other thing that certainty does, there's two arguments, or two, maybe not arguments, but two concerns that I'll often hear. One is, oh, well, if you're saying that we have to leave certainty behind, does that then mean that any explanation is as good as any other? So in other words, like, so if I'm going to avoid the certainty trap, I have to go join, the flat earthers over there or something. That's not, and I'm able to go into this and do in a lot more detail in the book. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that what we understand about the world is actually in the space of confidence, and not certainty. And you can and should have a conversation about sort of what moves us along a spectrum of confidence in what we understand about the world. But it's not the same thing as saying everything that we know, whether the earth is flat or spheroid, is a coin flip. That's not what it's saying. And then the other thing that certainty does is it leads us to be really sloppy in our thinking. So if one concern that I often get is, does this mean I have to believe really weird things? The answer is no. The other concern that I often get is, are you then saying, if you're saying the certainty is a trap, and also in the book I get to go into more detail, not all certainty is considered a trap, at least in my definition. But the other thing that it does is, so sorry, the concern is, uh, can we then not say this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong? That's the other concern that I often get. And the answer to that is also no, because fundamentally the book is not making a moral argument. It's not. It's not about. It's what I'm saying in the book is all of those claims that we make about this is good, this is bad. Those are all based on assumptions, and they're based on assumptions and values and beliefs and principles. What certainty does is it keeps us from making them explicit. And so nobody else gets to question them. We don't get to have a conversation about them. Like, an easy example would be, and I think I use this example in the book, like, if I'm looking out the window and I see someone stealing a car, right? And I say, and Ben, you're standing next to me looking out the window, and let's say I have reason to believe that this person is stealing a car, it's not theirs. And I say, my God, Ben, can you believe that guy? my expectation is that you're going to have the same sort of holy crap reaction as I do because you share my value that stealing is wrong. Now, with something like stealing, that's sufficiently universal that it's probably not a bad assumption. But when it comes to issues around race, gender, immigration, abortion, gun control, etc., we make those same assumptions and we don't make our thinking clear. And so part of avoiding certainty isn't saying that we can't declare this bad and this good. We absolutely can. What we need to do is to be really clear about what our standards are, what we're trying to optimize for, what our goals are, and what our values are, and understanding that someone else gets to challenge those and criticize them, even though you don't have to let them go. But other people get to question and challenge them.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I was thinking about too is that, certainty doesn't get you to truth. Um,
Yeah.
so are you helping people understand that if you really want to know, you should be more doubtful, or maybe have some level of skepticism, which is also maybe, I guess, a bit of a paradox, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always value in doubting our knowledge. In fact, I was writing this in a graph yesterday, where if you think of so sometimes I find these visual aids really helpful. But if you think of just, the upper right quadrant of a plane, of a Cartesian plane, and on the y-axis you have how much we still don't understand about the world. So the wording's a little weird because it's in the negative, but how much we still don't understand about the world. So the lower you are on the y-axis, the more we actually know, the less we don't understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And on the x-axis is time. And so what you get is this curve that kind of goes like this. And so this is coming to your question about truth. That's an asymptote. Like it
Yep.
never actually hits, you never actually the what you still don't understand about the world never gets to zero. So if getting to that line would be truth with a capital T, you can get closer and closer, but you never actually get there. There's no point when we are trying to understand the world where it's not a soccer game where there's a final whistle, the ref blows the whistle 3 times at the end of the game and then you're done.
Mhm.
And everybody walks off the field and we're like, "Whoa, that was great." Like it doesn't end. So, and there could always be something that we learn tomorrow that upends everything that we think we know today.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. Now, drilling a little bit deeper,
Yeah.
you touch on three fallacies that, sort of help you slip further and further into the certainty trap. The first one is the settled question fallacy. Can you
Mhm.
unpack that for us?
Yeah, so the settled question fallacy is kind of the first place that we end up, and this is sort of the when we this is the part really, again, so what the way I put it before was sort of treating our knowledge as definitive rather than provisional. That's sort of the one big subcategory of the settled question fallacy. So, in terms of contentious issues, it might be, the conclusions that we draw about the relationship between gender and biology, or the causes of and solutions to inequality, something like that, right? So these might be examples. The settled question fallacy can also look like treating our preferred solution as though it's all upsides and no downsides. There are no costs to it, right? So that can be also treating something as settled, treating a question about a heated issue as though the answers are obvious, and clear. That's part of the settled question fallacy. Um, but yeah, that's sort of the first. That's sort of oftentimes the first place where we get into trouble.
Yeah. And then the other one is the fallacy of equal knowledge. Help us understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, so once we start treating something as certain, or once we let certainty make our thinking sloppy, and then when we encounter disagreement, if we're feeling charitable, which we don't always feel charitable, God knows I don't. But if we're if we're feeling charitable, a lot of times what we'll say is something like, "Well, that other person just doesn't. They have the wrong opinion." That's because it's some opinion I object to. because they have the wrong information. And so if they just knew what I knew, and or if they just had the right information, they would have the right opinion. And I want to be really clear that that pointing that out is not the same thing as saying that information doesn't matter, that education doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm making a narrower claim, which is this assumption that if we all had the same information about policing, that we would all be of the same opinion. And it's simply not true. And so, but that's what the fallacy of equal knowledge is pointing to.
Yeah. And then finally the fallacy of known intent.
Yeah. So the third one is the fallacy of known intent. And so the fallacy of known intent is where we end up when, well, sometimes we can go straight there. But it's also where we end up when the fallacy of equal knowledge, when that sort of falls apart. And the reason the fallacy of equal knowledge can fall apart, there's two main reasons. One is, let's say I'm having a conversation with somebody about, I don't know, let's say gun control. And whatever their opinion, they have the wrong, in my view, the wrong opinion. And so I give them, well, so let me start with, there's two ways that this can fall apart. One is they demonstrate an adequate command of whatever the information is about gun control. Like, in other words, they know what they're talking about. They're not just, they've done some reading, whatever. Like, they demonstrate some level of being informed. So I can't then say, well, what your problem is that you don't have the right information. That's one possibility. The other is that as I'm talking to this person, I spend whatever, 15, 20, 30 minutes unloading my wisdom on them, and they still don't and they still don't change their mind. Right. So now the fallacy of known intent is one of these things has happened, or I've bypassed the fallacy of equal knowledge altogether. And now I'm just going to draw a conclusion about your intent. This is what certainty does, is if there's no other possible explanation for something, then why would anyone disagree? And so that comes from certainty. What we didn't talk about is that certainty it's the thing that drives our sense of moral indignation and moral outrage and righteous indignation, and by extension, contempt. And so that all has implications for how we communicate with one another.
Yeah. Is that where some of the cancel culture issues come from? Where, someone would say,
Yeah,
your intent, it couldn't possibly be a positive one,
yeah.
because you hold this view, so you can't, you just should be canceled or ostracized or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, the certainty trap, the problem of certainty, however, whether you want to use my name or whether you want to call it something else, you can trace problems of cancel culture, concerns over free speech, lack of viewpoint diversity in higher education, you know, quote unquote indoctrination in K through 12 schools. Like I'm not saying it's the single explanation, but it can all be traced to certainty, all of it. And it has implications for how we solve that as well, for how we address those problems. Cancel With respect to cancel culture, it's interesting. One of the questions that I often hear come up when people talk about cancel culture is this question of like, well, is it real? Is it really a problem? Or it's just that people are being held accountable for bad behavior? Or relatedly, sort of, does anyone ever really get hurt by it? Like, and we'll see these examples of these, this famous person or that famous person who gets canceled and then they have their own, Netflix special like 10 months later.
Mhm.
And so they're like clearly doing fine. And this becomes an argument about like, well, is it a problem? Like, is it something that we should be concerned about? Or is this just a bunch of sort of, a tempest in a teapot sort of made up? Coming at this through the lens of the certainty trap, I'm asking a really different question, which is, okay, we'd have to talk about specific instances, but in many of the cases where we talk about people being canceled, did the person actually do anything wrong in the first place? How do we think about that? How do we think about those social transgressions in the first place? I'm not focused on like, is it bad enough? Like, did this person get their, $10 million or $20 million for the next Netflix special? Whatever, I don't care. But it's a different question about like, how are we even coming to judgments about these things? Especially when there's another possible explanation, for whatever the thing. There's another possible way to see it. Ultimately, avoiding the certainty trap you have sort of two choices. One is, you know, commitment to kind of thinking through much of the time, particularly with heated issues, when we commit to thinking through, asking ourselves the question, is there a version of this position that I object to that would make sense to me? And by make sense, I mean that would avoid all of the fallacies we just described, not the subtle question fallacy, fallacy of equal knowledge, and the fallacy of known intent. Is there a version? And much of the time, the answer is yes. Much of the time, like I don't know percentages, but a lot of the time, the answer is yes. Once, and I'll get to what happens when the answer is no. Um, when the answer is yes, let's say I have different versions. Let's say there's this opinion that I object to. Let's say it's somebody who's opposed to affirmative action. And let's say I have different explanations for why this, in my mind, different explanations for why this person might be opposed to affirmative action. One of them is they're racist. One of them is, I'm just going to use two explanations. One of them is they're racist, and the other one is like this other explanation that I've come up with in my mind about why someone could be opposed to affirmative action. They could have, they could think that it's not the right way. I'm making this up. They could think that it's not the right way to allocate resources based on race, that it leads to more problems that it creates, that it, whatever. You don't have to, anyway, it's not about whether I necessarily agree with it or not. I'm just thinking through, is there a version of this argument? So now I have multiple possible explanations. It's a separate question about how likely for any given person who, in this case, in this example, is opposed to affirmative action, how likely is this explanation versus this explanation? That's a totally separate question. But now that I have multiple possibilities on the table, it's very hard for me to say, well, there's no chance, like the probability is zero, that it's this principled explanation over here. And if there's some chance that it's not the hate-filled explanation, which is also on the table, then it becomes much harder to become contemptuous, to view that person as harshly, because there's another possible way to see it. In the case where there's no possible way to see the thing, right? Like, so people, a lot of times for this, I'll get examples like slavery or the Holocaust, or actually someone or in this talk yesterday morning used the example of pedophilia, right? Like these things where there's no version of it where that would make sense to you by the definition of making sense. Then what you're doing is your commitment, in the interest of avoiding the certainty trap, is to be really clear about what principle or what value you're bumping up against something. If there's no version that you can come up with that makes sense to you, it's because you're bumping up against something that you sort of hit bedrock on. And so your commitment then is to be really clear about naming that, and letting someone else question it, but partly just naming it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it does. It does. These the set of items you've laid out and the fallacies that you've laid out
Yeah.
in the book, you mentioned that these things you would previously consider these things as part of critical thinking, but you have since moved away from describing these things as critical thinking. Can you, talk about why that is the case?
Yeah, I don't have anything against critical thinking. I just think it's really poorly defined. And I think that it's one of these things, like, if you ask educators, or if you ask, or anyone, ask parents, ask educators, ask students, if they're old enough to understand what the question means, no one says that, what the world really needs is less critical thinking. Like, no one. And it's a little bit like, in that sense, I would put it in the same or similar category: critical thinking, intellectual humility, and curiosity. All of these things are important, right? Like, I would say all of them. Again, if assuming we can
Right.
define them in a way that's clear. Um, the problem becomes that we're not very good at recognizing when we're not doing these things. None of us are. Like, by the time you realize, or by the time, for any of us, we realize that, wow, we should be a little bit, are we thinking critically about this? Are we challenging our own thinking? Are we being intellectually humble? Are we being sufficiently curious? By the time you're asking yourself that question, you're sort of halfway there. And so by thinking in terms of certainty and the certainty trap, what I'm saying is, nope, you can't wait for your own sense that you're lacking these things. We're just not good at it. you can pay attention to that sense that the answers are easy, that the other person's an idiot, a bigot, a snowflake, whatever. That's the thing that you're paying attention to. And that's why this work, the avoiding the certainty trap, is just as relevant. It's not actually about interactions. It's about thinking. It's about and it's just as relevant if you're in a room by yourself as it is if you are talking to someone else. The interactions matter. The idea here is that they are the outgrowth. They will improve when we transform the thinking.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually it's a great segue into my next question, which is
Yeah.
that interactions, because I think of this work as a partial critique of a lot of the sort of the civil discourse work, which
Yeah.
we are a part of. We have the Pluralist
Yeah.
Lab and things that we do to facilitate conversations across the divides and differences. And I think in the book you mentioned that this is more like aesthetic but the Serenity Trap sort of goes beyond that. And so I guess that's one of
Yeah.
the
I mean,
differentiation.
I think all, I mean, I've obviously a huge supporter of the Pluralism Center, the Pluralist Lab rather, and Mercatus. What I would say is that it's the work on civil discourse it's necessary but not sufficient, in the sense that you could have a room full of people following the norms of civil discourse and still, sorry to use my language, um, would still stuck in the certainty trap. And so uh, there's one way to think here. Let me give you one way to think about it in terms of how we think about democracy and sort of social stability, particularly as we go towards an election. But this is true generally. It's not just true in an election year. We tend to think about so let me just back up. This is going to sound like I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm going to bring it back right to where we were.
Go for it.
So we tend to think about threats to democracy as kind of coming from the left or the right politically, which leads to things like, if you're on the left, you see the threats to democracy as largely embodied in Donald Trump, but more specifically, election denial, or the refusal to peacefully transfer power, or whatever gets put on on that list. If you're on the right, you tend to see it as wokeness, this sort of self-censorship or censorship, free speech, this sort of the all of the concerns that get brought up around wokeness. Or again, I could use that's another poorly defined term, but it's a convenient shorthand. So that's how we tend to see threats to democracy. That does two things. One of the things that it does is it leads us to forget or not sort of pay attention to the fact that in a democracy, all of these are intertwined, and that the parties are intertwined, and that there are feedback loops. And the second, which is related to the second thing that framing does, is it allows us to sort of ignore our own role in creating the situation that we're in. And neither of those things are good. So we need a model, and this is where we're getting back to the certainty trap stuff. We need a model that actually reflects the situation that we're in and reflects how a stable democracy actually needs to function. So that model, if you think of, this is going to be in the next book. It wasn't in the certainty trap book. If you think of three blocks, and each block, so that's forming a tower. If any of the blocks, if the integrity is sort of disrupted or destroyed on any of the blocks, the whole thing can come down. And the tower is sort of the democratic stability. So the block at the top is what you might think of as the machinery of democracy. So we're talking about free and fair elections. We're talking about, limits on executive power, the separation of powers, all of these things that make a democracy, in an almost mechanical sense. And I don't mean that in any minimizing way. Right below that is a commitment to political pluralism. None of the stuff at the top matters if we don't have a commitment to political pluralism. Why should I care about your free speech rights if I have no commitment to political pluralism? A lot of organizations and a lot of the work on civil discourse, viewpoint diversity, et cetera, is focused on reinvigorating that middle level, that level about our renewing and reinvigorating our commitment to political pluralism. That clearly matters. There's one block underneath it. The block underneath it is the absence of contempt for people who disagree. You might think of it as neutrality. You might think of it as tolerance. Some of those, like tolerance especially, tends to be kind of a loaded word. So I really, in the for lack of a better word, the way I think of it is the lack of contempt for people who disagree. That's where the certainty trap is focused, is on that bottom block. So I told you it was going to seem like a tangent, and I was going to
Yeah.
bring it back.
Yeah.
So
Good.
that's kind of how I think about those differences.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for going through that. Now, so what happens when we're no longer in the certainty trap? Are we a less polarized nation as a result?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, if I could wave my magic wand, what would that
Hmm.
look like? Would it be just a bunch
Yeah.
of people sort of wandering around in total paralysis, unable to make a decision? Um, no, that's
Hope not.
I don't think that's the not that that's what you're saying, but I think that so it's an interesting question, and I have probably only half of an answer. Um, I'm under no illusion that this book is going to come out on September 2nd, and 340 million or 330 million people, whatever we are right now, it's like, oh,
Mhm.
done. I don't think that's actually necessary to end up in a better place than we are now, fortunately. I do think that you need, and this is where my answer is probably only half of an answer. There's some critical mass. I don't know what the number is. I don't know what the percentage is, but and maybe it's not a straight up percentage. Maybe it's, maybe it's primarily about higher education and the media, or, I'm not totally sure because we're not there yet. And sort of, I heard someone talk the other day. I heard someone use this comparison about, when people worry about things that are too far down the road. It's like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. I don't know who said
Mm.
that. Um, it sounds like an Elon Musk kind of thing, but I don't know if it was him. And so, like, yeah, what a critical mass of sort of shifting out of the problem of certainty. Clearly, the way we are now, particularly, there's a whole chapter in the book, as you know, about institutions and what the certainty trap means in institutions and what that means
Yeah.
for trust in institutions, where it's not, if our goal is to have a strong and sustainable democracy, it is not going to help us get to that goal. We are undoing our own efforts to sort of to have a strong democracy. So insofar as that's still our goal, there is some critical mass that needs to avoid I do think that there are some particular there's reasons to think that education and the media, like, are for probably reasons that are obvious, are particularly important, that could really change things. And so I think that in a world, and when my after I waved my magic wand, I think it's just less. I think it's a lot less of what we're seeing now. I don't think that it's gone, and by it I mean the contempt, the sort of the hostility, the viewing things as simple. I think it's a lot less, if that makes sense. That's why I said it was sort of
It does.
half an answer.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And it just got me thinking about how we also teach this
Yeah.
across the board, right? I know you've done some work at the sort of K through 12 level in your own courses
Yeah.
as a professor. I know you try to incorporate some of these things, but isn't this what a liberal arts education is supposed to do? Uh,
It is, and this is how far we've sort of drifted. And I mean, and part of it is there's so many reasons for it, but it is, I think it's what education should. I mean, I guess I have this one idea that the certainty trap book will sort of permeate its way through um our educational system, and that it would really bring some changes in education, because at K through 12 and higher education. Because I think it would address a lot of the problems. Again, I don't mean to say it's the one
yeah, no,
magic bullet, but I think
yeah,
it would actually, getting people to think about this, it would make there's a world where it makes an enormous difference in terms of how we think about education.
great. Now, for the listeners, um, what's your call to action? Uh, what is the thing that you think people should go out and do after reading this book?
It's an interesting question. Like, well, they should read the book.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then, I think you have to start. I don't know how to say this without sounding like sort of self-helpy, but which makes me want to gag a little bit. Um, but it is about changing the way you can't change what other people are doing. You can model it and you can change yourself. You can change the way you're thinking and interacting with the world. And so I think the thing is, pick some, there are in every chapter. At the end of every chapter, there's some little
Yeah,
exercises like try this, try
yeah,
this. I mean, you can use those, you can come up with your own, but to challenge your own thinking. I think that's where it starts because you can't tell other people what to do. You can model it though. And people will and people will see that. And it's not so much modeling a behavior because the behavior sounds like, well, I'm going to do these things and say these things with the goal of having a better interaction. That's fine. That's nice. But the call to action is really about analyzing and questioning your own thinking. Like it's not just like this is a lot of what's in the certainty trap book, and I try to make this point, is that this is you can ignore all of it. This claim that this idea that certainty fuels moral outrage, that certainty fuels righteous indignation, that this has implications for democracy. You can ignore it all, but it's kind of the way it is. Like it's not, I mean, I didn't create it that way. Like that's sort of the way it is. And so if you ignore it because you think that, the stakes are too high, because you think that I'm being naive in my assessment, whatever it is that you think, that's fine. But then you don't really have grounds to come and say that what you're concerned about is political polarization.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. Now, final question. What's your next book?
So the next book is the idea is it's going to be about the politics of shame. How the idea, and I reserve the right to change my mind and the title, but how the idea that intent doesn't matter divided a town and a nation. And so that is what I've been working on when I get the time.
That's excellent. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Alana, for taking the time to talk to us on
Thanks
Pluralist
so much for
Points.
having me.
Really appreciate it. And I want to encourage folks to check out the book. It's called The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. Thank you.
Thanks so much.